He boarded the plane alone. No assistant, no entourage, no designer suit, just a calm black man in a simple coat, walking toward seat 2A, unaware that the next 2 hours would ignite a firestorm heard across the country. What happens when a billionaire CEO is mistaken for a nobody? What happens when a flight crew, acting on bias and whispers, sets off a chain of events they can't control? And what happens when the man they tried to humiliate turns out to own the sky they fly in? This isn't just a story about race. It's about power, dignity, and what unfolds when calm meets cruelty, not with anger, but with unshakable truth. A flight that begins with judgment, ends with a national reckoning. So ask yourself, if the world didn't know your name, would they still respect your presence? Get ready to witness a story that will break your heart, shake your soul, and make you think twice before looking away. If you believe dignity matters, like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's board the flight. The boarding area at Gate 14 buzzed with the usual shuffle of briefcases, coffee cups, and boarding passes. Flight 772 to Phoenix was boarding. Passengers filtered through the final checkpoint. Business travelers in press suits brushing past families juggling children and backpacks. No one noticed the tall, soft-spoken man near the back of the line, dressed in a dark navy sweater, clean jeans, and worn brown loafers. His name was Julian Deveraux. He carried no briefcase, just a leather-bound notebook tucked beneath one arm and a calm expression that didn't quite match the chaos around him. He didn't belong to the scene, but that was the point. "Sir, are you in the right line?" asked the gate agent without making eye contact. Her name tag read Megan. She didn't look up. Julian offered a gentle nod. "First class. 2A. Megan Alcott blinked, finally looked. Her mouth twitched. She didn't say anything, not yet, but her silence hummed with static. She scanned his ticket anyway, that slight pause between her beeps saying more than words could. Then she handed it back without a word and turned to the next passenger. Julian stepped onto the jet bridge. The air shifted the way it always did, slightly cooler, slightly thinner, as if even oxygen understood it was about to enter an enclosed space where hierarchy ruled. The flight attendant at the front of the aircraft was young, sandy-haired, and had a smile that looked printed instead of earned. His name tag read Lance. He stood straighter when he saw Julian, though not in welcome, more like suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sir Julian offered it without resistance. He had done this before. Lance Burrell narrowed his eyes. "This is for 2A. First class. Yes. You're Mr. Deveraux?" "I am." A pause, then a glance toward the cockpit, then back at Julian. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I double-check something." He didn't say what that something was. He didn't need to. Julian stepped back without a word. Other first-class passengers began arriving, some with loud voices and louder perfumes. None were asked to verify their seats. None were told to step aside. A middle-aged white man in a Patagonia vest gave Julian a once-over, then looked away quickly, pretending not to have seen. A woman with a Hermes scarf clutched her purse just a little tighter as she passed him. Lance returned with another agent. Megan from the gate. "We're showing a system error," Lance said, now less polite. "You may have been mistakenly assigned a seat that doesn't match your profile." "My profile?" "This is a premium cabin, sir." Julian took a breath, then another. "What kind of profile are you referring to?" he asked calmly. But the question was met with a shrug and an awkward silence. Lance's smile flickered, revealing the thin thread of defensiveness beneath. "Sir," Megan added, "if you'll come with us, We can try to reassign you elsewhere." Julian didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. He turned away slightly, voice low. "It's me," he said. "Gate 14. Flight 772. It happened again." He ended the call without waiting for a response. Passengers in the aisle watched him with the kind of curiosity that only arises when something feels off. But no one said a word. No one stood up. The moment was heavy. Still. The kind of stillness that sits just before thunder. Julian followed them off the plane. 10 minutes later, a man in a dark suit approached the gate. He didn't introduce himself. He simply flashed a badge. Behind him came 2 more, then 3. The terminal went quiet, as if something sacred or dangerous was about to break. "Where is seat 2A?" one agent asked. Lance Burrell, now visibly confused, pointed back toward the aircraft. "She was just here," he said. "I mean, he left." The agent stared at him a moment too long. "We know." Passengers at the gate began filming. One woman whispered, "Is he a diplomat or something?" Another asked, "Did they really kick him off?" Someone murmured, "I think that guy owns part of an airline." Inside the jet bridge, the agents moved quickly, efficiently. Lance was escorted to the side. Megan was asked to sit down and wait. The captain came out of the cockpit, visibly tense. Then Julian reappeared. Same calm walk, same worn loafers. This time, no one questioned him. He stepped back into the aircraft, into the aisle, and slowly moved toward seat 2A. A pin-drop silence followed him. Even the engine hum felt quieter. Julian took his seat without looking at anyone. He placed his notebook in his lap. He folded his hands, and he waited. Julian Deveraux sat quietly in seat 2A. His posture was straight, composed. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He simply rested his hands on the armrest as if he belonged there. Because he did. The murmurs around him grew. Passengers shifted in their seats, craning their necks slightly, sensing something unfolding, something unscripted. In row 3, a young couple whispered behind open menus. A businessman across the aisle pressed pause on his podcast and slid off one earbud. The mood in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a flight. It was a moment. Julian didn't move. Then came the footsteps. Firm, measured, intentional. 2 men in tailored Navy suits entered the aircraft. Their presence rippled through the cabin like wind through tall grass. Each wore an earpiece. One carried a thin tablet. The other scanned the row numbers as they walked. Passengers instinctively straightened their backs or looked away. They stopped at row 2A. "Mr. Deveraux," the man with the tablet said, voice calm but unmistakably firm. Julian looked up, nodded. The agent glanced toward the galley where Lance Burrell stood, now visibly pale. "Flight attendant Burrell, please step into the front galley," the taller agent said. Lance hesitated, opening his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came. He knew. He saw it in their eyes. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't protocol. This was accountability, and it was rare in his world. The other passengers watched in silence as Lance was escorted from the aisle. He didn't return. From the cockpit, the captain emerged, clearly unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. His gaze landed on Julian, but Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look his way. 2 more agents stepped on board, then another. Someone in the back gasped. Julian remained seated. A woman from the middle of the plane stood slowly, holding her phone. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. Was that man? Was he removed earlier? The shorter agent turned. Yes, ma'am. The woman, dressed in a gray cardigan and sensible shoes, looked at Julian with wide eyes. That was wrong, she said, voice cracking. I saw it. I didn't say anything then, but he didn't do anything wrong. They just assumed. Julian offered her a kind, slow nod. It meant more than words. Another passenger, an older black man with a salt and pepper beard, spoke up next. I've seen this before, he said softly. Happened to me, but I didn't have anyone walk back in for me. Julian's throat tightened. He didn't plan this part. He hadn't expected people to speak up, but maybe that's what happens when someone simply sits down and refuses to disappear. Across the cabin, a teenage girl turned to her mother. Is he the boss? She whispered. Her mother hushed her gently. The air hung heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was thick with awakening. Julian unfolded his notebook, slowly, as if marking a page in history. He drew a single line across the top. Then he wrote in calm block letters, Gate 14, Terminal B, Flight 772, Incident Profile Protocol Violation, Name Burrell. Witnesses, 2A, 3D, 7C, 12A. Emotional tone managed, community response stirred. He paused before the final line. Silence level, breaking. Outside the aircraft. Lance Burrell was seated in a private security room near the terminal. His hand shook as he gripped a paper cup of water. No one said much. The agents weren't cruel. They weren't angry. They were precise, measured, documenting. Did you question any other first-class passengers? One asked him. I know. Just... It was a busy gate. I didn't recognize him, Lance muttered. Was there a reason to assume he didn't belong in 2A? Lance looked up, eyes tired, voice low. No, I just didn't expect someone like him to be sitting there. Someone like him, the agent repeated. Lance swallowed hard. Back inside the aircraft. Megan Alcott sat in a window seat, staring out across the tarmac. She had been ordered to remain on board until formal statements were collected. Her badge had been taken. Temporarily. They told her. Just a protocol. She didn't cry, but her fingers twisted the hem of her blazer. Julian noticed her from where he sat. He didn't hate her. That wasn't his way, but he would not protect her either. Complicity didn't need shouting. It thrived on quiet nods, on the subtle clicks of boarding passes without eye contact. The boarding was paused. For 27 minutes, no one boarded, no one deplaned. The airline's internal team arrived a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, whispering to the captain and then to the agents. Her gaze lingered on Julian, not with recognition, but with uncertainty. She didn't know who he was. She only knew something had shifted. Passengers whispered. A few stood to stretch, but no one raised their voice. Julian turned to the window and stared at the tarmac. He thought of his father, Arthur Deveraux, and a flight in 1969 when a uniformed crew member tore up his boarding pass in front of his wife and sons because he didn't look like a ticket holder. He was a professor. No one believed him. He walked home. That night, Julian was 10. Now, he was 54, and the flight crew was different. But the story hadn't changed. Sir, said a new voice beside him. A young woman, maybe 14, stood in the aisle. She wore overalls and carried a sketchbook. Her curls were pulled into a puff, her eyes wide but steady. My name's Lena, she said, voice quiet. Are you, like, Important. Julian smiled gently. Not really. Lena hesitated. Well, my mom says you changed something. That people like you don't shout, but the air listens. Julian nodded, deeply moved. What's in the sketchbook? She flipped it open. It was a drawing of an airplane cabin with a man seated in row 2A. Everyone else had no face. Only the man was detailed, calm, outlined in gold pencil. I didn't finish it, she said. I didn't know what happened next. Julian blinked. Maybe, he said. You should draw them all waking up. Lena grinned. Behind them, the boarding resumed. Julian didn't move. His notebook stayed open in his lap. His pen remained ready, because the sky was listening now. Julian Deveraux sat alone in his hotel room, the low hum of a distant city siren rising and falling beneath the soft whirl of the ceiling fan. Room 1214, Midtown Phoenix. Nothing luxurious, just quiet. The room was plain, by design. A firm bed, a desk, a coffee maker with 2 packs of sugar and 1 of powdered creamer. He liked that. Simplicity was something he understood, something he trusted. His phone buzzed once on the table. A message from Nina Rue. They don't know who you are. Not yet. He stared at the screen, letting the words settle. Then he turned his gaze toward the window. The city stretched out below, glittering in slivers of orange and steel, oblivious to the fact that one of the most powerful men in commercial aviation was watching it silently from behind a half-closed curtain. Julian leaned back in the chair, hands resting on the arms, body still. Only his mind moved. They didn't know who he was. Not Lance Burrell, not Megan Alcott, not the passengers in rows 2 through 14, not the gate manager, nor the pilot, nor the assistant who had called in a delayed boarding notice without even looking up. And that was exactly the way Julian had planned it. Not for ego, not for drama, but for truth. It had started 7 months earlier, in a quiet meeting room on the 41st floor of the Aris One Global Headquarters in Atlanta. Just 4 people had been there. Julian, Nina, an ethics consultant named Dr. Harrison Cho, and Frederick Lang, the former chief of crew culture now retired, flown in from Vermont. The walls of that room were lined with annual reports, compliance scores, customer service benchmarks. On paper, the airline group was among the best in North America. Top-tier ratings, platinum staff, a cultural promise to make the sky feel like home. But in Julian's heart, something didn't sit right. He'd seen too many reports that were quietly buried, too many stories that began with words like he looked out of place, or she seemed agitated, or we were just following protocol. And so, that day, he said aloud what none of the reports ever did. If our sky is only safe for some, then it's not safe at all. That was the moment he decided to disappear. He wouldn't announce himself. He wouldn't wear the suit. He wouldn't be the chairman. He would be just another passenger. Julian called it the Underflight Initiative. Nina helped set it up. Burner tickets, rotating aliases, low-profile seating, random routes, no security detail, no advance notice to any airline under their corporate umbrella. Just Julian, observing, listening, experiencing. He'd flown 18 times. Over the past 7 months, 18 flights, 18 crews, 18 versions of reality. And what he saw broke his heart more than once. He'd watched a black mother and coach get scolded for rocking her toddler in the aisle, while a white father in 1A was given extra pillows for his child. He'd watched a Middle Eastern teenager be told his carry-on was too large and forced to check it, while a white businessman with a bag the same size boarded without a word. He'd watched a Filipino nurse struggle with a broken in-flight entertainment system, while attendants walked past her 6 times before she was helped. And he never said a word. He wrote. He documented. He filled page after page in his notebook, noting not just what was done, but who it was done to, and who did nothing. Because silence, he believed, was the real currency of injustice. Not hatred, not even fear. Silence. He stood now and walked slowly across the room to the desk, where 4 notebooks sat neatly stacked. He picked up the top one. The cover was worn from flights and fingerprints. Inside, his handwriting filled every page. Julian turned to a random entry, Flight 603. Denver to Dallas. Attendant told elderly black man to step aside so she could help real ticket holders. She never apologized. Crew laughed after. Man sat silently in 23C. His name was Warren. He never looked up again. Julian exhaled, long and slow. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about punishment. He wasn't chasing revenge. He was chasing reflection. He needed his team to see what he saw, to understand how a culture built on image could become one that eroded dignity, quietly and consistently. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a link, a video, sent by Sophie Delacroix, a journalist he trusted. He clicked play. It was shaky phone footage from the terminal earlier that day. Gate 14. A woman's voice narrating softly behind the camera. This black man was told he didn't belong in first class. They made him leave the plane. Then something happened. These men came. Quiet. Serious. The whole energy changed. I don't know who he is, but I think he's someone who matters. Julian watched himself walk back onto the plane, watched the silence that followed him, watched Lena Hartwell stand beside him, holding her sketchbook. He paused the video, rewound, froze the frame where she held the book open, that golden-lined outline of seat 2A. A single tear traced down his cheek. He hadn't cried in years, but this wasn't sadness. It was release, because somewhere between the seats and the silence, people had started to feel again, to ask, to notice, to wonder. He turned toward the wall, where his jacket hung from the back of a chair. Inside the pocket was a folded envelope. It was addressed in his father's handwriting. He had found it after Arthur passed. It had never been mailed. Julian opened it now, the paper fragile from age. Son, one day you'll be in a position where they won't see you coming, not because you're hiding, but because they've never bothered to imagine you. When that day comes, don't shout. Just stand. The world will hear you anyway. Julian folded the letter back. His phone buzzed again. A third message from Nina. Board approved your ethics summit. 3 weeks from now. They want you to lead it. He smiled. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't have a choice. It was no longer a boardroom issue. It was an airborne reckoning. He picked up his notebook and wrote one final line for the night. Power isn't about walking in with a title. It's about walking in, being ignored, and still having the power to change everything. The next flight departed under the veil of morning haze, barely past 6. Gate 19B. Julian Deveraux wore a black quarter-zip sweater, slacks, and a baseball cap pulled low. To most, he looked like a quiet, tired man catching an early flight, maybe headed to a conference, maybe home. This time, he wasn't flying first class. He had booked a seat in 23A, the back of the plane. He wanted to listen from there. As he stepped on board, the hum of plastic boarding passes against scanners blended with the murmur of sleepy greetings. The flight attendant at the front, a woman with silver blonde hair and a name tag that read Chloe Danner, glanced at him, smiled politely, and then moved on to greet the white couple behind him. No acknowledgement, no welcome. Julian didn't mind. He'd stopped hoping for manners. His row was still empty. He slid into 23A and leaned toward the window. The sky was still waking up, peach and lavender clouds streaking across the horizon. Somewhere in those clouds, he found space to breathe. The seat beside him remained empty as boarding continued. He noticed how quickly the crew helped certain passengers with overhead bins, how readily they smiled for businessmen and tall, white teens in sports jerseys. But for others, an older Latina woman in row 30 who needed help lifting her bag, a black man trying to get a stroller gate checked, there were delays, shrugs, polite refusals disguised as policies. That's what troubled Julian most. It was never loud. It was the quiet rejection, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the instructions that turned into accusations the moment the skin tone changed. Across the aisle, a boy in a red hoodie was watching him, probably no more than 8 or 9. His headphones glowed with blue light, too big for his head. Julian smiled slightly. The boy smiled back, then whispered something to his father and pointed. Julian turned away. He didn't want attention. He wanted to observe. The seat beside him was finally filled a young woman in a navy jumpsuit and a leather backpack. She smelled faintly of lavender. As she settled in, she offered a polite nod. "Morning," she said, adjusting her seatbelt. Julian nodded back. "Morning. Long day ahead. We'll see." She smiled. "Same." They didn't speak again. The captain's voice came on overhead, clipped and efficient. Pre-flight safety checks were completed. Cabin lights dimmed. The plane began to taxi. As the aircraft turned onto the runway, Julian closed his eyes. He thought back to a different day, a different flight. Years ago. Tokyo, New York. He was seated in business class then, wearing a suit, tie-crisp briefcase neatly stowed. He had offered his seat to an elderly woman whose companion had been separated from her. The flight attendant, an older white man, had looked at Julian and said, "Are you sure you're allowed to give up that seat, sir?" He'd said it half-jokingly, chuckling to himself, but it stuck with Julian, as if even generosity had to be earned. The plane lifted off the ground. Julian opened his eyes. The cloud swallowed the view. About 30 minutes into the flight, the woman beside him pulled out a novel. Something literary. He recognized the author Toni Morrison. Interesting. After a few pages, she glanced at him again. Her voice was soft. "Mind if I ask what you do?" Julian paused. He could have lied. He often did. But something about her felt safe. "I work in transportation," he said. She smiled. "Planes, trains, or automobiles?" He smiled too. "Planes, mostly." She nodded. "My father worked in aviation, not commercial, military. Passed away last year." "I'm sorry." "Thanks." He always said, "The sky tells you everything you need to know about people. Who panics? Who listens? Who respects the air?" Strange thing to say, but I get it now. Julian turned to look at her fully for the first time. She was maybe in her early 30s. Brown skin, natural curls pulled back, intelligent eyes, grounded. "My name's Elise," she said, offering her hand. "Julian." He shook it gently. For a moment, the plane felt quieter, lighter, as if the two of them were suspended above the noise of the world. Then the overhead chime rang. A flight attendant's voice crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor issue with the beverage cart. We'll begin service shortly." Julian watched as Chloe Danner rolled the cart forward. He noticed how she skipped entire rows, barely glancing at passengers who didn't look like they belonged in the aisle. When she reached row 23, she hesitated. Julian offered a polite nod. "Coffee, please. Black." Chloe blinked at him. "That's not included in your fare." "I understand. I have my card." She huffed slightly, swiped the card, then moved on without a word. Elise raised an eyebrow. "Wow." Julian said nothing. He sipped the coffee. It was lukewarm. Moments later, he saw something shift 3 rows ahead. A black teen no more than 16 was holding up a small white bag. She looked distressed. The woman next to her was pressing the flight attendant call button repeatedly. Julian could see the girl's hands shaking. The mother's voice was raised. "But calm. She told you her medication is in that bag. You threw it out." Chloe Danner arrived, visibly annoyed. "Ma'am, we ask passengers to consolidate personal items. It's not our responsibility that she has asthma." The woman interrupted. "There's a rescue inhaler in that pouch. You threw it in the disposal bin." Julian stood. Elise looked up in surprise. Julian. But he was already in the aisle, moving with purpose. He reached row 20 and crouched beside the girl, whose breaths were now shallow, fingers twitching around her sweater. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Kayla," she whispered. Julian turned to the attendant. "Do you understand what you've done?" She didn't say it was medical. Chloe snapped. "She's 16. You didn't ask." Julian turned to the mother. "Do you have a spare inhaler? It's in checked baggage." Julian stood tall. "Then we need oxygen and a doctor. Now." The silence in the cabin was sharp. Chloe didn't move, but someone behind Julian did. A woman in a navy blazer and glasses rose quickly. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Cardiac unit. I've got her." The woman moved to Kayla's side, speaking calmly, checking her pulse, coaching her through breaths. Chloe disappeared to the front. Julian returned to his seat. Elise stared at him. "You said you work in planes, but I think it's more than that." Julian met her gaze. Sometimes the air needs to be cleared before people can breathe. And for the first time in days, he let himself breathe too. Julian Deveraux sat motionless, hands folded gently on his lap. The hum of the plane was steady, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Kayla, the young girl who had struggled to breathe moments earlier, now rested with her head leaned against her mother's shoulder. The nurse sat quietly beside them, her hand still lightly on the girl's wrist, counting breaths. The oxygen mask had arrived late, but just in time. Chloe Danner had returned to the front galley. She hadn't apologized. The captain made no announcement, no public acknowledgement of the mistake. The incident dissolved into whispers and nervous glances, like fog that refused to lift. Julian stared out the window. Clouds drifted by, soft and indifferent. Elise Monroe leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was low but unwavering. "You didn't hesitate." Julian blinked. "She couldn't breathe," he said simply. Elise tilted her head. "But most people, they look away. They wait for someone else. You didn't." He didn't respond. He didn't know how to explain it, how deeply it lived inside him, the quiet urgency that had grown from years of watching the world turn its head the other way. He didn't move because he was brave. He moved because it was unbearable not to. "Do you know her?" Elise asked. "No, but I've known her my whole life." That made Elise pause. She didn't press, but her eyes said everything. Julian reached into his backpack, pulled out the notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. He wrote slowly, Flight 11A2, Gate 19B, Row 23A, Passenger Kayla. Event medical emergency due to confiscated personal bag. Crew response. Delayed. Civilian intervention. Yes. Apology. None. Passenger community alert. Emotional tone. Disturbed. He stared at the words, then underlined the last line twice. Elise leaned over. You're not just a man who works in planes. Are you? Julian smiled faintly. I'm a man who listens to them. She looked down at the notebook. That's a lot of listening. It has to be. The plane bumped gently with turbulence. The seatbelt sign came on. A few overhead bins rattled. In the front galley, Chloe Danner was whispering into the intercom, her face tense, hand covering her mouth. She wasn't talking to the captain. She was talking to someone else. Julian could guess who. It had happened before. Every time he intervened in these quiet injustices, someone filed a report. Not about the injustice, but about him. Suspicion. Disruption. A black man standing. A black man speaking calmly but directly. A black man pointing out harm. The system didn't always need shouting to get nervous. Calmness unnerved them more. He sipped the coffee again, still bitter, still tepid. Row 20 was now silent. Kayla was sleeping. Her mother had tears in her eyes. The nurse had returned to her seat. But before she left, she handed Julian a folded napkin with her contact info. Just in case someone tries to say it didn't happen like that, she whispered. Julian nodded and tucked the napkin into his notebook. The boy in the red hoodie across the aisle tapped his dad's arm and pointed at Julian again. This time, the father looked. He gave a slow nod, respectful, knowing. Word was spreading. Not about Julian's name, not about who he was, but about what he did. People were connecting the calm man in 23A to the moment when someone cared enough to move. The cabin was watching now. At the front, the intercom beeped, a different voice this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge an onboard medical situation earlier in the flight. Thanks to quick assistance from a medical professional and a helpful passenger, the situation is now under control. Thank you for your cooperation. There was no mention of the mistake, no apology, no accountability. Julian closed his eyes briefly. That's how they did it. They used sanitized language, words that erased blame, words that flattened harm into situations. He flipped to another page. Language note. Sanitized incident framing. Diffuses liability. Neutralizes emotion. Erases accountability. Patterns repeating. Elise turned to him again. What are you going to do with all of that? Julian stared at the words. Show it to the ones who refuse to see. She leaned back, eyebrows raised. That sounds revolutionary. He smiled faintly. No, it's just overdue. The plane jolted slightly as it began descent. The captain's voice came on, announcing approach into Kansas City. Passengers stirred, gathering belongings, fastening seatbelts. Elise began to pack up her things, then paused and turned back toward him. I'd like to know who you are, Julian. He looked at her, calm. And I'd like you to decide that for yourself. She studied him for a beat, then nodded slowly. No name drop, no ego, just presence. As the plane descended, the cabin grew brighter with morning sun. Shadows crawled across tray tables and knees. People squinted into the light. Row 20 stirred again. Kayla sat upright, groggy but smiling. Her mother kissed her temple. The nurse gave a subtle thumbs up from row 26. The boy in red waved. And Julian? Julian simply closed his notebook. The wheels touched down. As the aircraft slowed to taxi, Chloe returned down the aisle. She didn't stop at his row. She paused near the exit, whispering to another attendant, her face still tight. Her eyes flicked toward him once, then away. Julian noticed. She didn't want to admit what had happened, didn't want to be seen as the problem. But that was the heart of it all, wasn't it? Nobody thought they were the problem. They just thought they were doing their job. He watched passengers file out row by row. Some glanced at him. Some smiled. A few offered small nods. When Elise stood, she turned to him one last time. "Whatever you're doing, Julian, don't stop." He gave her a quiet smile. "Neither should you." Then she was gone. Julian stood, waited until most had exited, then stepped into the aisle. He paused near row 20. Kayla looked up, her eyes clear now. "Thank you," she said softly. Julian knelt briefly beside her. "Take care of that voice. All right?" She nodded. Then he stepped into the aisle and walked toward the front of the plane. When he reached the galley, Chloe Danner was nowhere in sight, but the captain stood near the door. He glanced at Julian. Their eyes met. Julian held the gaze. Just long enough for the man to realize this wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who had been watching long before the sky turned gold. Someone who had remembered everything. Someone who had returned to make sure it would never be forgotten again. And as Julian stepped off the plane into the bright morning air, he felt the shift, not in the system, but in the people. The cabin was watching now, and it wouldn't stop. Julian Deveraux stepped into the terminal at Kansas City International, his feet slow, his mind full. He had just lived through another moment that would never make it into a company report. No one would document the near medical emergency, the missing inhaler, or the soft tears of a teenage girl who had been humiliated midair. No one from the crew would remember the nurse's name. There would be no follow-up, no reflection. But Julian would remember everything. He walked toward baggage claim, hands in his pockets, backpack slung low. His steps echoed faintly in the clean terminal corridors, the ones lined with billboards declaring the airline's pride in diversity, comfort, and sky-high hospitality. He almost laughed. As he waited at the carousel, he pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from Nina Rue. 1 text. "You made news. Again. Don't panic." "I handled it." He opened the link she sent. A photo. It was grainy, taken from behind, but unmistakably him kneeling beside Kayla mid-flight, hand gently resting on the armrest, looking her in the eyes. Below it, a captioned passenger helps asthmatic teen mid-flight as crew allegedly mishandles medical bag. Julian sighed. He didn't want press. He wanted progress. His bag finally slid onto the conveyor. He grabbed it, hoisted it over his shoulder, and walked outside to the pickup curb. A black town car waited, engine running. The driver stepped out quickly. "Mr. Deveraux." "Good morning." Julian gave a soft nod. "Thank you. Martin." He ducked into the back seat and pulled the door closed behind him. The driver merged into traffic with practiced ease. Julian exhaled, long and heavy. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for the leather folio beside him. Inside was a sealed document, embossed in gold Altitude Initiative, Internal Cultural Audit Phase Y. Beneath it, a subtitle. When titles don't matter. This was supposed to be just a field report, quiet, strategic. But it was evolving. It was becoming a reckoning. Julian flipped to a page in the middle. Notes from Flight 603, Flight 447, and now Flight 1182. Names redacted, but stories preserved. He underlined a sentence. The deeper issue isn't how passengers are treated, but how quickly we forget the ones who weren't. He stared out the window. Kansas City rolled past in slow-motion suburbs, corner gas stations, a barber shop with a faded mural of Jackie Robinson on the wall. It reminded him of home. Julian had grown up in Baton Rouge, not the shiny side, the side with broken sidewalks and grandmothers on porches. His mother used to work 3 jobs school cafeteria by day, janitor at the DMV by night, and on weekends she did hair in their tiny kitchen. She used to say, "People see the uniform before they see the person, baby. So wear yours with pride, but don't ever let it tell you who you are." He hadn't thought about that in years. Now, sitting in the back of a car, wearing sneakers, a plain sweater, and a name no one recognized, Julian understood the power of being unseen, because that's where the truth lived. They didn't clean up their act for him. They didn't soften their tone. They didn't double-check policy, because to them, he was nobody. And that was when they showed who they really were. The car turned onto a quieter road, pulling up to a small community center with a faded blue awning. The sign out front read Fly Right Alliance, Regional Staff Training. Julian stepped out. He wasn't here to lecture. He was here to watch. Inside, the training room was bright and humble. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Folding chairs formed a circle. No PowerPoint. No podium. That was intentional. He believed real conversations happened when people were face to face, not hidden behind clicker slides and corporate jargon. Today's session was one of many listening labs that Julian had personally commissioned. He didn't attend all of them. He was only supposed to observe this one quietly. But today, something felt different. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Marcy, welcomed him with a nod. "Glad you could join. Julian, we weren't expecting you." He smiled. "Just here to listen." The session began. 10 flight attendants, 2 pilots, 1 gate agent, diverse ages, mostly white, a few black and brown faces, 1 woman who identified herself as Pacific Islander, and 2 young men who looked no older than 23. Marcy opened with a simple prompt. Think of a time when you felt powerless on a flight, not because of turbulence or weather, but because of people. There was a long pause. Then one of the older attendants, a man named Greg, spoke. "It was last year. A black woman in seat 3A asked for sparkling water. Another passenger white guy, probably mid-50s, started mocking her accent. I told him to stop, and he said, 'You people are too sensitive.' I reported it. Nothing happened. Later, I was told to be mindful of guest comfort. I haven't said anything since." Someone else added, "I once asked a supervisor why we never have brochures in Spanish. He said, 'Our premium passengers don't really need that.' I didn't push it." A younger woman in the back cleared her throat. "I was trained to always double-check large carry-ons when the passenger looked suspicious. I didn't question it until I realized it always meant black or brown folks. Now I just feel sick every time I say it." Julian listened quietly, hands folded. It was all here. The patterns, the fear, the silence. Marcy turned to him suddenly. "Julian, would you like to respond?" He looked up slowly. "I wasn't planning to," he said, "but maybe it's time." He stood, stepping gently into the center of the circle. "I've flown 18 times in the last 7 months." He began, each time under a different name, different seat. No one knew who I was, and that was the point. The room went quiet. "I've watched you, your teams, your passengers, and what I saw wasn't hate. It was neglect. It was bias disguised as policy. Comfort zones defined by skin tone. Smiles that changed depending on who's boarding. No one moved. He continued, I don't believe any of you wake up hoping to hurt someone, but I do believe you've been trained to ignore when it happens. A young man raised his hand. Why would someone like you go undercover? Why not just fix it from the top? Julian looked at him with calm eyes. Because if I walked in as the CEO, all I'd hear is what people think I want to hear. And I'm not interested in theater. I'm interested in truth. He paused. And the truth is, this isn't just about customer service. This is about human dignity. Silence. Then a voice in the back. What now? Julian took a breath. You're going to help me build something new. A new training model. A new culture council. A new system for truth-telling. We're calling it the Flight Equity Framework. You'll be part of its pilot launch. Greg leaned forward. What if it makes people uncomfortable? Julian nodded. Then it's working. And just like that, something shifted. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was hopeful. The room had heard him. And more importantly, they believed him. The next morning, the sunlight hit differently. Julian Deveraux sat alone at the window table of a small diner on the edge of the Kansas City airfield. It was the kind of place where coffee came in chipped mugs and the waitstaff called you Han. The air smelled of toast, grease, and thyme. He liked it. There was something about quiet places like this, how they held stories without needing to shout them. His notebook lay open beside a half-eaten plate of eggs. The scribbled words blurred slightly from the coffee stain left by a rushed refill. He tapped the pen against his chin, then wrote, Day 47. Emotional residue from Flight 1182 remains strong. Cultural dissonance is no longer theoretical. It's personal. Outside the window, a small regional jet took off. He watched it rise slowly, as if testing the air before deciding to trust it. A voice interrupted his thoughts. You mind if I sit? Julian looked up. Elise Monroe. Same natural curls, though pulled into a tighter bun today. A long camel coat, soft leather gloves, and a briefcase slung over her shoulder. She looked sharp, grounded. Julian gestured to the seat across from him. I thought you were headed back east. She smiled, setting her bag down. I changed my plans. You said people like me shouldn't stop. I decided to take that seriously. He nodded slowly. Coffee black, please. The waitress arrived just in time, poured a fresh cup for her, topped off Julian's without asking. Elise wrapped her hands around the mug like it was a lifeline. Julian studied her for a moment. Why are you really here? She didn't flinch. Because you're doing something dangerous, and I don't think you should be doing it alone. He sat back slightly. Dangerous. You're pulling back the curtain on an entire system. That scares people. You know that, right? Julian looked down at his notes. It should scare them. But it also isolates you, she said gently. You think staying quiet keeps you safe, but silence has a cost. 2. Julian didn't respond right away. Instead, he closed the notebook. My mother used to say, we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. I've tolerated too much for too long. I thought being calm would keep me safe. I thought if I smiled enough, earned enough degrees, built enough companies, I could avoid being reduced to a threat in someone's eyes. But the truth is, no title protects you when someone's decided you don't belong. Elise's gaze softened. Then stop protecting them. Start protecting yourself. He met her eyes. That's why I'm here. Their conversation was interrupted by a vibration from Julian's phone. He checked the screen. A message from Nina Rue. Gate 14. Redbrook Airlines Flight 781. Issue reported. Recommend immediate observation. Security involved. No injuries yet. Julian stood immediately. Elise raised an eyebrow. What happened, I don't know, but I need to be there. He threw down a 20, grabbed his coat and notebook, and they walked quickly to the rental car outside. As Julian drove, Elise read the full update Nina had just sent. Passenger reportedly removed from first-class seat by crew after boarding. Passenger had valid boarding pass. Bystanders attempted to film. Crew called security. Passenger described as disruptive male in his 50s, African-American, dressed in business attire. Julian gripped the wheel tighter. That's the fourth this quarter, he murmured. Same playbook. Different city. They pulled into the airport parking structure 10 minutes later, bypassing the main terminal and heading toward an employee access gate. Julian flashed a special pass, an old credential from a subsidiary he'd helped acquire years earlier, and the guard waved them through. Gate 14 loomed ahead. There was tension in the air before they even entered the concourse. 3 security officers stood near the gate, one speaking into his radio, the other standing beside a middle-aged black man in a gray blazer with a leather laptop case at his feet. His shoulders were square, his eyes tired but fierce. Julian didn't need a backstory. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself. Passengers clustered in small groups nearby. Some recorded discreetly with their phones. Others whispered. A few had already sat down, trying to pretend nothing unusual was happening. Julian approached slowly. The security officers didn't recognize him. Neither did the gate agent Young. Pale, hair slicked back tight. His eyes flicked to Julian and then away. But the man in the gray blazer looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition not of face, but of pain. Elise leaned in. What's the play? Julian stepped forward. Good morning. I'm with Executive Oversight. May I ask who initiated the passenger removal? The gate agent blinked. I'm sorry. Who Julian calmly showed an internal clearance badge and tapped his phone, where a blank screen glowed with a made-up dashboard app. The illusion was precise. He lowered his voice. Do you know who this man is? The agent paused, caught between protocol and fear. He was in the wrong seat, he said finally. First class is reserved. He refused to move. Julian turned to the man. Is that true? The man's voice was calm. I showed my boarding pass. Seat 2A. They didn't believe me. Julian nodded. He turned back to the agent. Is the seat now occupied? The agent swallowed. Yes, by another passenger. Who? The agent glanced down. Mr. Langston? Platinum tier? And his ethnicity silence. Elise stepped forward. She asked about ethnicity. You hesitated. Why the agent looked like he might melt. Julian spoke gently but firmly. Rebook Mr. Langston elsewhere. Apologize to this man. Comp his fare. And log the report under protocol DEI 07A. Then email your supervisor to inform them the gate is now under external review. The agent's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the keyboard. Security slowly stepped back. Julian turned to the man in the blazer. May I see your boarding pass? He handed it over. Julian nodded. Thank you for your patience. Mr. Tyson, Dr. Tyson Carter. Julian smiled faintly. Good to meet you, Doctor. Crisis diffused. Not because of rank, but because someone knew the language of power well enough to speak it calmly. Tyson Carter shook his head softly. This happens every year. Always a different city. but it's always the same flight. Julian exhaled slowly. I know. That's why we're changing the airline. Tyson stared at him. You're with them. Julian nodded. Not for long. Tyson didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his bag and reboarded the plane. Julian watched him walk down the jet bridge. When he turned back, Elise was watching him closely. How long have you been doing this? Long enough to lose count? She looked away for a moment, then said quietly, You can't do it forever. Julian's voice was soft. No, but I can do it long enough to make sure the next black man in 2A never has to explain himself to 3 uniforms and a gate agent with a clipboard. And with that, he walked toward the observation window, watching the jet push back from the gate. A man had returned to his rightful seat, but the fight for dignity was still on the runway. It was close to midnight when Julian returned to his hotel room. The hallway had that dry, recycled air, unique to airport hotels, clean, quiet, impersonal. He stepped inside, dropped his bag on the armchair, and turned on the dim lamp beside the bed. The soft yellow glow made the space feel just enough like somewhere a person could think. He sat at the edge of the bed, pulled off his shoes, and exhaled. It had been a long day, but the moment at Gate 14 still replayed in his mind. The image of Dr. Tyson Carter standing beside security, boarding pass in hand, humiliated for occupying a seat that was legally his. Julian had stepped in, diffused it, reclaimed order, but the question haunted him. How many other Dr. Carters were never seen? He opened his laptop and launched the encrypted folder labeled Shadow Flights. Inside, dozens of reports, time-stamped and sorted by city, flight number, and passenger status. He clicked the most recent Flight 781, Redbrook Airlines, incident wrongful seat reassignment and racial profiling. Passenger Carter, Tyson, Dr. Below. Julian began typing how. Incident summary. Gate 14, MCI, Dr. Tyson Carter. A well-dressed black professional with a confirmed first-class boarding pass, seat 2A, was accused of seat confusion and asked to vacate his assigned seat. No procedural misstep was cited, no evidence of error. His replacement, a white elite status passenger, was boarded without verification. Security was summoned preemptively. Key observations. No formal apology issued. Crew defaulted to disbelief without cause. Security presence escalated a routine misunderstanding. Cultural bias evident in crew's tone and choice of language. He paused, then added, emotional impact displacement, public humiliation, deepened mistrust in corporate accountability structures. Echoes prior incidents on flights 212, 603, 47, 1182. He leaned back in the chair. This wasn't an isolated pattern. It was a recurring blueprint. And still, the system had not blinked. He clicked open a new tab and accessed a restricted database, one he'd helped build from scratch over a year ago. It contained what the airlines never published: notes from whistleblowers, private testimonies, anonymized videos, redacted transcripts. At the top of the page was a phrase that kept him going. The manifest doesn't list dignity, but we track it anyway. He scrolled through entries. A black grandmother detained in Phoenix because a flight attendant thought her accent was fake. A young Sikh man removed from a flight in Charlotte because his seatmate felt nervous. A Latina executive publicly asked to prove she had paid for her own upgrade. They were all there, hidden in plain sight. Julian's vision blurred slightly. He rubbed his eyes, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, planes moved silently across the tarmac. Clean lights, perfect lines. From up here, you'd never guess that injustice lived at 30,000 feet. Elise's voice returned to him from earlier that day. You can't do this forever. Maybe not. But what was the alternative? Let the silence win. He walked back to the table and picked up the printout from Nina, a list of internal employees who had submitted anonymous feedback about discriminatory experiences. Some of them had names. Most didn't. He read them carefully. One in particular stood out. I used to believe in the company, until I saw the same passenger profile get pulled for additional screening 5 times in 3 weeks. I asked why. They told me to stop asking. Gate agent, anonymous, ORD. Julian set the paper down slowly. He opened his notebook and began drawing something. A tree, its branches sprawling outward, uneven and tangled. At the base, he wrote, roots bias, trunk policy, branches training, leaves human consequence. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. He took a breath, then pulled up the next day's itinerary. Flight 920, Redbrook Airlines, route Kansas City to Denver, aircraft A321, gate 7A, assigned seat 4C economy, plus. He smiled faintly. He could afford any seat in the world, but he chose that one, because at the back of the plane, the mask dropped. There was a knock at the door. He tensed for a moment, then approached. It was Elise, in sweats and a hoodie this time, hair pulled back, eyes tired but focused. She stepped in without speaking. Julian raised an eyebrow. Elise. She sat on the armchair without invitation. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing him. Dr. Carter. Julian nodded. Me too. She looked around, then spotted the printout. You have a list of them. Don't you? I do. She swallowed. I want to see it. Julian hesitated. That file was more than sensitive. It was sacred. But then he remembered her on Flight 1182, how she didn't look away when Kayla was gasping, how she didn't flinch when the crew avoided responsibility, how she stayed. He handed it over. She read quietly. After several minutes, she whispered, How do you keep going? Julian walked to the window again. I remember what it felt like the first time someone called me boy on a plane. I was 23, in a tailored suit, holding a first-class ticket. The flight attendant looked right at me and said, You'll need to step aside, young man. We're about to board real passengers now. Elise's mouth tightened. He turned to face her. I keep going because I know if I stop, nothing changes. They count on our exhaustion. She met his gaze. I'm not exhausted. I'm angry. He smiled softly. That's how it starts. She stood up. What's tomorrow's flight 920, Denver? I'll book a seat. Julian tilted his head. You don't have to follow me. I'm following the truth. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Julian said something he hadn't said aloud in years. I used to think fixing the system meant climbing to the top of it. But maybe fixing it means tearing down the floorboards and showing everyone what's been hiding underneath. Elise nodded slowly. Then let's show them. She left, and the room fell quiet again. Julian returned to his desk and opened the manifest. He typed in bold, Manifest Revision, Flight 920 Special Purpose Observation Flight. Passenger watch list open. Emotion index active. Intention exposure. Outcome dignity. Then he whispered to himself, We're not flying to Denver. We're flying into the heart of everything they've refused to see. And for the first time in weeks, he slept with his notebook on the pillow beside him. Because the manifest might not record names like his, but he would remember them all. Julian Deveraux sat quietly in seat 4C, the narrow cushion beneath him firm, the armrest slightly scratched from years of elbows and coffee spills. The cabin lights flickered once before settling into the familiar warm glow. Passengers moved down the aisle with the same tired rhythm he'd seen on every flight before, mothers carrying babies, men in wrinkled suits, elderly couples asking for help with the overhead bins. Today was supposed to be simple. Kansas City to Denver, 2 hours and 7 minutes of sky. But Julian didn't board planes for the destination anymore. Oh, he boarded for what people revealed when they thought no one important was watching. From his aisle seat, he scanned the cabin discreetly. A young Latino man in 4A, earbuds in hoodie drawn tight around his head. A South Asian woman in 5C, flipping through a textbook titled Advanced Nursing Practices. In row 6, a tall white man in a camouflage jacket, speaking loudly to the passenger beside him about how he never trusts TSA when they look like they're from overseas. Julian's jaw tightened, but his face remained still. People had learned to code their prejudice into concern, to package fear as policy. A flight attendant passed by, tall, blonde, lips tight with practiced politeness. She offered a brief glance at Julian's row, then kept moving. No greeting, no acknowledgement. He took mental note. Row 4. No eye contact, no greeting. Elise Monroe appeared 2 rows back, sliding gracefully into 6B. She gave Julian a faint nod, then pulled out a paperback. Her eyes scanned the page, but he could tell she was listening to every conversation around her. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for departure. Please stow your carry-on items and return your seat backs to the upright position. Julian sat back, breathing deeply. He remembered his first business flight years ago, when he still felt proud to board a plane in a blazer, when he believed that class and title could shield him, but class didn't change perception, and title didn't erase bias. The flight took off smoothly. Julian watched the clouds rise outside his window, then disappear. 20 minutes into the flight, the cart rolled out from the galley. The same blonde attendant began serving drinks. She smiled warmly at the white couple in 3A and 3B, offered them pretzels and a choice of wine. She leaned in when they laughed, told a short story about her layover in Austin. Then she reached Julian. Her expression didn't change, but the warmth disappeared. "Drink?" she asked flatly. Julian glanced at her name tag. "Water, please. And a lemon if you have one." She poured the water without a word. No lemon. He took it anyway. 2 rows back. Elise was watching. As the cart moved on, Julian opened his laptop discreetly and began typing observation log. Flight 920. Differential service tone. Noted. Warmth, laughter offered to white passengers. Neutral or cold tone used with others. No attempt at small talk or hospitality cues with me or South Asian woman in 5C. Camouflage jacket man 6A overheard saying, "I don't like the look of that guy near the exit row," referring to the young Latino male in 4A. Julian paused. He turned toward the young man in 4A. The kid looked barely 20, eyes low, posture careful. He hadn't moved once since boarding. Julian leaned slightly and spoke softly. "Hey, you doing all right?" The young man looked up, startled. Julian smiled gently. "I just noticed you haven't touched your drink." The kid hesitated, then shrugged. "They gave me apple juice. I asked for orange." "It's not a big deal." Julian's voice remained calm. "It is a big deal if it keeps happening." The kid looked away. Julian didn't press, but he added it to the log. Another 30 minutes passed. The lights dimmed slightly. Flight attendants moved down the aisle checking seat belts. The man in 6A was still talking louder now, this time about border security and how airports don't feel American anymore. Julian glanced at Elise. Her jaw was locked. He sent her a quiet text. Don't engage. Log it. We need the pattern more than the argument. She didn't reply, but she nodded once. Then something happened. The man in 6A stood suddenly and tapped the call button. The blonde attendant returned. I think the guy up there, he whispered loudly, pointing toward 4A, has something under his hoodie. He's been fidgeting. Looks nervous. You might want to check. Julian's heart dropped. The attendant nodded. We'll take care of it, sir. She turned toward 4A, but Julian stood before she could move. I'm sorry, he said gently, but I've been sitting next to him the entire flight. He hasn't fidgeted. He's been listening to music and minding his business. The attendant looked caught off guard. Sir, I'm not asking for your input. Julian didn't raise his voice. But you should. Because what you're about to do, targeting a young man of color based on nothing but one passenger's discomfort, could have serious consequences. She glanced toward the back. A second attendant, male, appeared beside her. We just need to ensure the safety of the cabin, he said. Julian kept his voice calm. Then start with the man spreading fear, not the one sitting quietly. The air grew tense. Passengers were watching now. The kid in 4A looked terrified. Elise stood. May I speak as a witness? She said clearly. This gentleman in 4A has done nothing wrong. If he's removed or interrogated, I'll be recording the full exchange and will file a report immediately. The male attendant shifted awkwardly. The blonde one hesitated. Then she stepped back. No need for escalation, she said tightly. Julian didn't sit down yet. He turned to the kid. You good? The young man nodded. Eyes wide. I'm good. Thanks. Julian looked back at the attendants. Let's all remember what good judgment looks like, and what prejudice sounds like. The cart rolled away. The man in 6A sat down, fuming. Julian opened his laptop again. Final log entry, Flight 920. Attempted profiling thwarted. Passenger in 4A protected by direct intervention. Multiple witnesses. Social escalation avoided. Systemic fear of black and brown passengers continues to be normalized under safety concerns. Emotional residue on all parties high. He closed the laptop, then leaned back in his seat and breathed. Because this wasn't just a flight to Denver. This was a flight through America's mirror. And even when you landed, the reflection followed you. The flight touched down in Denver just after noon. Julian waited until the cabin was nearly empty before standing. He helped the young man in 4A retrieve his backpack from the overhead bin. You held your ground, Julian said softly. That takes more than people know. The kid looked at him, tired but grateful. I didn't even do anything. That's the part that gets me. Julian nodded. That's why it matters. As they stepped off the plane, a light snow had begun to fall outside the terminal windows. Elise caught up to Julian near Gate 9. I downloaded the security footage request form already, she said, just in case they try to bury the report. They will, Julian replied, adjusting his coat. That's why we need to send it before they know it exists. They made their way to a quiet airport lounge where Julian had arranged a private meeting space. Elise opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as Julian dictated, incident title, targeted suspicion of passenger 4A on Flight 920, Airline Redbrook Airlines Flight number 920. Kansas City to Denver. Date yesterday's date. Flight attendants involved female blonde, late 30s, male mid-40s, brunette, glasses. Reporting Officer Deveraux. Julian, Chairman, Altus Aviation Oversight Division. He paused, then added, Witnesses Monroe, Elise, Passenger 4A. Name withheld by request. Multiple cabin passengers in row 5 to 7. Elise looked up. Do you want to name the instigator in 6A? Julian shook his head. Not yet. Let them request the footage. Let them see how comfortable that man was starting a chain reaction just because someone didn't look right to him. Elise hit save. Then she looked at Julian. Do you ever get used to this? He sat down slowly across from her. No, but I've stopped letting that surprise me. The door to the lounge opened. Nina Rue stepped in briskly, hair tied back, iPad in hand. She looked serious. You need to see this. She slid the device across the table. On screen was a social media post already with 23,000 shares. A blurry photo, taken by a passenger mid-flight, Julian, standing near the flight attendants, Elise nearby. The caption read, Man in row 4 standing up to airline crew after they tried to profile teen passenger. Didn't raise his voice once. Just stood firm. We need more of this. Below were thousands of comments. Respect. He handled it with grace. This happens all the time, and no one talks about it. Who is he? Julian closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't planned to go public, but maybe it was time. Nina leaned forward. You know this is going viral. If your name gets out, the media is going to spin this into every narrative they want. Let them, Julian said quietly, because what they'll find is the truth. And we've already logged every piece of it, Elise added. We're not asking for attention. We're asking for accountability. Julian reached into his bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. On the front was the Redbrook Airlines corporate logo. I drafted a letter to the board last month. Never sent it, but now. He handed it to Nina. Inside was a full resignation from his consulting post with Redbrook, alongside a scathing 12-page report citing over 30 cases of racial discrimination on board Redbrook flights, all compiled from first-hand observation, data, and internal whistleblower accounts. Nina looked up. You're sure Julian's eyes didn't waver? They wanted quiet consulting. I offered them systemic truth. They ignored it. So now they'll receive it through a different channel. He pulled out a second copy of the same document, this one addressed to the Federal Aviation Ethics Board. Elise exhaled. That's the real strike, isn't it? Julian nodded. The FAA will investigate, and if they confirm what we've shown, Redbrook's licenses, federal subsidies, and tier partnerships will be on the line. Nina sent the first packet. Elise sent the second. Within minutes, the storm had started. That evening, Julian walked alone near a pedestrian bridge overlooking the Denver skyline. The air was crisp, and the lights below shimmered against the snow-dusted rooftops. For a moment, he let the silence hold him. He wasn't thinking about Redbrook. He was thinking about his father. He remembered the first time they boarded a plane together. He was 10. His father wore a navy suit, pressed the night before. Julian had worn a small blazer, proud to match. At the gate, a woman had asked, "Are you escorting this child today to his father?" His father hadn't flinched. "Ma'am, that child is my son, and he belongs beside me." Julian had never forgotten that. Not the words, not the calm in them, and not the fact that 30 years later, the world still questioned where black men belonged. Behind him, footsteps approached. "Elise, I figured I'd find you here," she said. Julian smiled faintly. "I just needed a moment." She joined him at the railing. They stood in silence. Then she asked, "Do you regret it? Going public?" He shook his head. "I regret not doing it sooner." She leaned on the railing beside him, There's going to be backlash. I know. They'll call you angry. Say you're making it about race when it's about procedure. Julian laughed softly. That's what they always say. Until the procedure changes. She looked at him. So what now? He thought for a long moment. Now we make it impossible for them to pretend they didn't see. He turned to her. We published the manifesto. Elise blinked. You mean the internal report? The full version, Julian nodded. All of it. Every log. Every incident. Redacted names where needed. But the world needs to see the pattern. Because you can't reform what you refuse to admit exists. Elise smiled. Then she pulled out her phone. I've already started formatting it. Thought you might say that. He looked at her, surprised, then laughed. You're dangerous. Only to systems that survive on silence. They stood there, wind brushing past them, city lights flickering like signals in the dark. Julian felt it in his chest, the quiet ache of purpose, the weight of doing the hard thing when it would have been easier to walk away. Tomorrow, headlines would swirl, executives would scramble, PR teams would panic, but none of that changed what happened in Seat 4A, and none of it could erase what he'd promised himself long ago, that no one would ever feel alone in that aisle again. At precisely 9:14 Julian's phone rang. The number was unlisted, but he knew exactly who it was. He let it ring once, twice, then picked up Julian Deveraux. There was a pause, then a voice measured, clipped, and unmistakably corporate. Julian, this is Howard Strickland, chairman of Redbrook Airlines. Julian didn't say anything. Strickland continued. I think you know why I'm calling. I do. Another pause. Julian leaned back in his chair, the hotel blinds behind him casting long shadows across the carpet. We'd prefer to handle this internally. Strickland began. What you've released, this so-called manifesto, it's already begun to disrupt our partnerships. Our investors are uneasy. Our legal team is reviewing everything. Julian kept his tone even. You've had access to this information for over 6 months. We gave you every opportunity to address it, yes. But you didn't need to go public, Strickland said, voice tightening. You blindsided us. No, Julian replied calmly. You blinded yourselves? Silence. Then Strickland shifted strategy. What do you want? Julian didn't answer right away. He looked down at the open laptop in front of him, where headlines were beginning to stack up. Whistleblower CEO exposes widespread discrimination on Major U.S. Airline passengers calm defiance. Sparks nationwide. Airline reckoning or my manifest of dignity. Surpasses 5 million views in 48 hours. I want change, Julian said simply. Strickland's tone turned defensive. We're not a racist company, Julian. No one ever is, Julian said. Until the receipts are laid out. Strickland sighed audibly. We're willing to make some gestures, additional training, a formal apology to the passenger on Flight 920. Julian cut in. Not enough. Strickland was silent again. Then, begrudgingly, he asked, What are your terms? Julian clicked open the document he'd written at dawn, after a sleepless night of reflection. First, he said, you issue a public apology not just to the passenger from Flight 920, but to every passenger who has experienced discriminatory treatment on your airline. No euphemisms. Use the word. Strickland bristled audibly. You mean racism? Yes. Say it out loud. Julian continued before he could argue. Second, you implement a third-party equity oversight committee to monitor in-flight interactions, crew training, and passenger treatment. The committee will publish quarterly transparency reports, accessible to the public. Strickland groaned. Julian, that's a PR nightmare. No, Julian said. It's a moral compass. Third, Julian went on, you established the Dignity Fund, a $5 million initiative to provide legal support, mental health resources, and public accountability mechanisms for passengers harmed by bias on any major airline, not just yours. Strickland snapped. That's not even our responsibility. Julian's voice remained calm, but firmer now. If you want to be seen as a leader, act like one. There was a long, brittle pause. Then Strickland asked, more quietly, and if we don't agree, Julian closed the laptop. Then I let the next story drop. The one about your executive VP reassigning gate crew schedules in Newark to reduce complaints from certain communities. I've got the emails, time-stamped, screen-capped. Strickland didn't respond. Julian leaned forward. You've built a culture of silence. Howard, but silence isn't neutral. It's a strategy, and that strategy is collapsing. Another moment passed. Then Strickland said something Julian didn't expect. What happens after we change Julian considered the question. He walked to the window, watching the morning sun reflect off the icy rooftops of Denver. Then we watch, Julian said. And if you do this right, we support you. But if you fake it, the public won't let you recover. Strickland exhaled. I'll need to convene the board. You have 48 hours. He ended the call. That afternoon, Elise walked into the lounge with coffee and 2 printed copies of the manifesto's first media edition. The headline was printed in bold. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. Julian smiled faintly. They're making me a symbol, he murmured. You already were, Elise replied. You just stopped hiding it. They sat together in the quiet. For the first time since it began, the noise around them had slowed. But inside, Julian felt something deeper, moving. Not relief, not even vindication, something quieter, like the start of healing. He turned to Elise. Do you remember that little girl on Flight 1182, he asked? The one who cried when the attendant threw away her medication? Elise nodded. She's the reason I didn't quit, Julian said. Elise looked at him, eyes softening. You've carried that flight in your heart this whole time. He nodded. She didn't deserve to be treated like that. And she'll never even know what her courage started. They were quiet for a moment. Then Elise reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. What's this? Julian asked. A letter, she said, from the young man in 4A. He found my email. Asked me to give this to you. Julian opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note. I didn't speak up on that flight. I couldn't. I was scared. But watching you stay calm, watching you stand up for me, made me feel like I mattered. I want you to know that when I got off that plane, I applied to college. I hadn't planned to. I didn't think I had it in me. But now I do. Thank you. Mateo Julian held the letter in both hands. The words blurred as tears stung his eyes. He hadn't cried in years. But now, he let them fall quietly. Because this was the reason. Not the press, not the calls, not even the reforms, but the moment a young man stepped out of fear and into a future he could finally imagine himself in. A knock came at the door. Nina stepped in, tablet in hand. Julian, she said. Redbrook's board just released a statement. Julian stood. Nina read aloud. We acknowledge the failings highlighted by Julian Deveraux and his team. Effective immediately, Redbrook Airlines will launch a third-party equity oversight committee, contribute $5 million to the new Dignity Fund, and issue a formal apology to affected passengers. We commit to doing better, not because we were forced, but because it's long overdue. Elise looked at Julian. He simply nodded once, then walked to the window again. Below, planes moved in quiet symmetry across the snowy runways. But today, something was different. For the first time, the sky felt open, and the path ahead, no matter how long, was one he would walk with purpose. Julian Deveraux stood at the terminal window in Gate 14, watching a row of children press their faces to the glass, giggling as a plane slowly taxied toward the jet bridge. Behind him, the gate area was unusually quiet. No announcements, no overhead static, just the soft hum of engines in the distance and the delicate footsteps of change settling into place. It had been 2 weeks since Redbrook's public statement. In that time, everything had shifted. The manifesto had gone global, not as a scandal, but as a signal. Passengers were now speaking up mid-flight. Airline workers from other companies reached out with stories of quiet injustice they had witnessed for years. News outlets no longer referred to Julian as whistleblower. They called him something else, architect of accountability. He wasn't sure how he felt about that title. He wasn't looking to be remembered. He was hoping things would be behind him. Elise Monroe walked up, holding 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with oat milk and cinnamon, Julian's preference. She handed it to him wordlessly and stood beside him, sipping hers. "They released the first transparency report this morning," she said. "Over 300 flight attendants voluntarily requested retraining." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Voluntarily?" She smirked. "Okay. So maybe the threat of termination helped. But some of them were sincere. Some of them apologized, not just publicly, but to people, by name." Julian nodded slowly. "That's how it begins." They watched another plane lift into the sky, its wings catching the golden morning light. "Where to next?" Elise asked. Julian didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the clouds, steady and unhurried. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe we don't go anywhere. Maybe we stay. Maybe we build." "You thinking of launching something?" she asked, curious. Julian turned to her with a quiet smile. "I've been thinking about the girl." Elise tilted her head. "Which girl? The one from Flight 1182? The one whose medication was thrown out? The one who looked up and realized no one was going to help her? The one I failed?" Elise shook her head gently. "You didn't fail her. You just weren't ready then. You are now." He looked back out the window. "I want to start something for her. For every child who gets told they don't belong. For every elderly mother asked to prove she paid for her seat. For every first-time flyer who hesitates before asking for water because they don't want to be a bother." Elise put her cup down. "What's it called?" Julian's voice was soft but clear. "The sky belongs to everyone." She smiled. "I like that. It'll start with education. Not just crew training, but community outreach, school partnerships, legal literacy for passengers, programs that help kids from underrepresented communities learn about aviation, how planes work, how flight paths are charted, how careers are built above the clouds. And funding." Elise asked. Julian turned to her. "We've already got it. The Dignity Fund is expanding. Other airlines want in. Even rival CEOs are asking for private meetings. They're scared, but they're listening." She laughed. "They're listening because they know what happens when they don't?" Julian nodded. "They've seen the gate. They've heard the story. They've read the logs." He grew quiet. "It's not about punishing bad people. It's about unlearning bad systems." A familiar voice interrupted their moment. "Mr. Deveraux." They turned. A middle-aged woman stood nervously with a teenager at her side. The boy looked no older than 16, dark curly hair, glasses, a shy smile. Julian smiled warmly. "Yes." The woman stepped forward. "I'm sorry to bother you. We saw you on the news. My son, Mason, he's training for his pilot's license. He just wanted to say something." The boy looked up. "I read your report," he said quietly, "and I didn't think people like us were allowed up there." He pointed toward the window, toward the sky. Julian kneeled slightly so they were eye to eye. "You're not only allowed," he said, "you're needed." Mason smiled. The woman whispered thank you, tears in her eyes, and they walked away. Mason turned once before disappearing into the crowd, still smiling. Elise watched in silence. "That right there," she said. "That's why we stay." Julian stood slowly, feeling a weight lift that he didn't know he'd been carrying. He pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, typed a single sentence. "The sky does not belong to privilege. The sky belongs to courage." He looked at Elise. "I'm going to write it." The book, he nodded. All of it. The silence. The struggle. The boy in 4A. The woman in row 7. The letters. The failures. The moments I didn't speak. The ones where I finally did. Elise raised her coffee. "Then here's to the voice that broke the silence." He clinked his cup gently against hers. "To the voices still finding theirs," he replied. They walked slowly through the terminal, the sun rising higher behind them, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Around them, the world moved like it always had boarding calls, rolling luggage, impatient sighs. But something was different now. Not the noise, the listening. People were paying attention because the story had been told, and it hadn't been shouted. It had been whispered, firmly, clearly, unapologetically, in a tone so calm it couldn't be ignored. That evening, Julian sat alone in his hotel room. No media lights, no conference calls, just a notebook and the quiet tap of pen on paper. He began to write. Not the manifesto, not the report, just the truth. He wrote about his mother's hands, rough from work but soft when they braided his hair. He wrote about being 12 and told by a flight attendant that he must be lost in the first-class section. He wrote about Mateo in row 4A, about Mason in the terminal, about the gate agent who didn't look up until the name on the manifest matched the skin tone she expected, and about the world he wanted to leave behind, one where you didn't need a title to be treated with dignity, one where every seat came with humanity, one where you never had to explain why you deserved to be there. He paused, stared out the window at the blinking lights on a plane soaring overhead, and wrote the final line. The sky belongs to everyone, but sometimes someone has to prove it first. He closed the notebook and exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from freedom. He never raised his voice. He didn't demand revenge. He simply told the truth and refused to let silence win. Julian Deveraux' story isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about the cost of quiet prejudice and the power of choosing calm resistance over chaos. In his stillness, he exposed something loud, something systemic, something we've all seen but often ignore. A child silenced, a passenger profiled, a man underestimated, until the world saw who he really was. Let this story stay with you, not just as a tale of justice, but as a mirror. Because the question is never just, what did they do to him? The question is, What would you have done if you were there? Would you have spoken up? Would you have looked away? Or would you have stood, even when your voice trembled? We hope this story stirred something in your heart, love, outrage, hope, or all three. And if it did, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel for more powerful, real stories that challenge what we think we know and remind us of who we ought to be. Because the sky belongs to everyone, and the story's not over. Not yet.